Welcome back here. We're continuing now our Morning Cup of Joe interview with Sheriff Joe Lombardo. We've been talking about the protest. We talked about the incident involving George Floyd in Minneapolis, his death at the hands of Minneapolis police. And we also talked about the shooting of the officer on Monday night as well here in town.
Yes. We want to go back, though, to the protests, which are continuing now for several days here in Las Vegas. Sheriff, thank you again for being with us. Governor Steve Sisolak did call in the National Guard to assist with protests here last night in Las Vegas. Has enough been done to assist your officers at these protests?
Yeah, I believe so. Interesting you talked about the National Guard. And I follow the press stream just like anybody else because the head of an agency needs to know what's going on in the community and what the temperature is of the community. And I see there's been some criticism of the governor and his when and if he was going to call the National Guard. And I think the general public has a misconception on that type of element when it comes to protests and assistance in police agencies. Yes, it's valuable to have a human being and numbers to assist you because the protesters quite often outnumber the police officers, which is not a problem at face value. But the National Guard coming in is not a panacea by any means. They don't train for these type of incidents. They're not used to engaging the general public in these type of situations because that's not what their expertise is. Whatever their specialty is in the military is what they're trained to do. So we bring them in as basically a force multiplier. In our situation, we utilize it more in a security apparatus than anything else versus a one-on-one interaction with the general public. They can assist us in securing our properties and our equipment, such as our vehicles and all that stuff. That doesn't mean I'm trying to diminish their ability or what we need to use them for. It's just that we don't train together, and that's very important for people to understand, for us to understand how they're going to react in a volatile situation, how we're going to react, what is the standard of the law that they have to, parameters that they're restricted with. So we try to utilize them in the best authority that is given to them. And I don't want to, again, diminish their help and their support. It's wanted, and it has been provided by the governor, and we're utilizing that resource. I just want people out there to know that it's not the panacea and the solution to everything that we deal with.
We have seen a lot of peaceful protests here in Las Vegas, and as we've talked about, in some cases they haven't been, unfortunately. A lot of videos circulating and people chiming in on social media, Sheriff, as they do. Wanted to ask you what the threshold is when officers determine when the protest needs to be ended by force or to disperse the crowd.
Well, that's a good question, and it's asked quite often during these type of incidents. And there is no answer, Alex. It depends on the actions and the counteractions of each side of the fence. So what I mean by that, we fully intend to allow people to protest or demonstrate or express their views and communicate and everything they do in those type of situations. And I guess per se the threshold would be is when they start to endanger the general public, people that are outside of the demonstrators, or even the demonstrators themselves and or law enforcement. With that being said, there's a dispersal order when, say, the commander of that particular incident makes a decision, hey, this is starting to get dangerous, they're impeding the general public and their ability to go about their lives. They're causing harm by throwing rocks, bottles, missiles, anything you want to describe in that effect. And it's time for us to provide a dispersal order and time for them to move on and cease the event. And what I mean by the dispersal order, it's a verbal dispersal order that is given by a commander out on the scene, usually via bullhorn, and it has to be 3 times with 10 minutes in between each other. So about 30 minutes to give the people the opportunity to leave. They've been warned sufficiently. It's time for you to leave and go about your business. And what has happened in that anatomy of these protests day over day is eventually make the decision, it's time to disperse them, we give the dispersal orders, and that's when the rocks and everything else start to fly with zest, I would say. So at that point, we identify the key agitators and attempt to get them into custody and hoping to quell the violence.
Sure.
And that's what happened with Officer Michelanis. You know, at that point, we gave the dispersal order. We wanted people to put into custody, and then the tragic events associated with that.
Well, Sheriff, you mentioned when those arrests take place that the officers try and look for the agitators. We've seen a lot of arrests that have taken place. We've seen the use of tear gas, pepper spray, not only in some cases peaceful members of the protest, but also members of the media. Are you at all somewhat concerned, critical, or are you pleased with the actions at some of the more highly charged moments of these protests?
Well, that's a good point. But here's the deal. A lot of times when you're seeing that, there's a perception maybe because they're peaceful or they're docile. You usually don't see the back end of what's taking place prior to the effect of the arrest. But included in that, even though it may have perception that they're docile and they're not the ones actually throwing the rocks per se, they might be encompassed in the dispersal order. So by the fact that they're remaining in place and refusing to move, they may be part of that group. And once the dispersal order is given and you have not left, you are violating the law. And that's basically failure to disperse. So those journalists that you are opining on or discussing or describing, they were caught up in that type of fray. So the officers didn't have the ability to determine whether they were journalists at the time. This is what my understanding of the incident. Obviously, it'll play out in court, I'm sure, but that was part of that type of incident where they're caught in the fray and they refused dispersal orders.
Sheriff, in the last segment, you talked about some of the black eyes from Metro Police in the past. There have been efforts to try and address that through federal court procedures, the ACLU, etc., in the community. If one of the crux of some of these protests is social justice, equality, and police accountability, some would suggest there are still issues with Metro when it comes to public records, when it comes to dealing with some members of the community, use of certain kinds of chokeholds and other efforts within the department. Don't those also have to be addressed in order to sort of try and appease all parts of the community?
Yep, you're absolutely right. And you haven't described or said one particular type of issue that we haven't addressed or we haven't compromised or got in discussion with or discussed in the court system on each one of those. So I don't think as an organization we've missed any particular incident or type of policy or procedure that we need to address. And when I say black eye, yeah, you're exactly right. We failed to act previously. But in today's age and in current time, I think we've been pretty successful. And a lot of that is cooperation with the public and dealing with outside organizations to develop that compromise. And I'm very proud of our robust relationship with the community, in particular communities of different races and cultures. The Metro Multicultural Advisory Committee has been in place and has very robust power within my organization. They quite often bring those particular type issues forward, and we're happy to discuss with them, compromise, and change how we do business.
Sheriff, we only have a few seconds left, but want to ask you really quickly, a lot of resorts on the Strip are reopening tomorrow. How will Metro be involved with this, especially as these protests continue?
Well, first and foremost, I have to applaud that they're opening. I think we need it. I think people need a release. The economy needs a release. And, you know, one of the unfortunate things of this civil, and I wouldn't say civil unrest, this protest and demonstrations is the COVID-19 has fallen on the backside, and I think people have lost sight of that. It's still out there, and we have to address it, continuing to move it forward. But with that said, I'm glad the resorts are opening. We've been in constant conversation with their security apparatus, as a police department should be in these type of situations. We're given advice both ways on how we should do this going forward in conjunction with the Gaming Control Board and all the preventive measures put on the floor space of these casinos. So I guess to answer your question, Alex, it's been a robust communication back and forth, and hopefully we're going to be back with success here tomorrow upon the grand openings. And then our economy has a release for our local residents as far as unemployment and anxiety and everything else that we deal with on a daily basis as a community, which may be part and parcel to some of the frustration of people participating in these demonstrations. It may not be all about Mr. Floyd on its own and social injustice on its own. It may be about just what the hell's going on in our lives here recently.
All right. Sheriff, we are all out of time, unfortunately. Thanks for taking the time. We appreciate it, and we send our very best to Officer Mikalonis.
Sheriff, thank you very much.